I will be reading from Ecclesiastes 3:16 to 22. And I saw something else under the sun. In the place of judgment, wickedness was there. In the place of justice, wickedness was there. I said to myself, God will bring into judgment both the righteousness and the wicked. For there will be a time for every activity, a time to judge every deed. I also said to myself, as for humans, God tests them, so that they may see that they are like the animals. Surely the fate of human beings is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. Humans have no advantage over animals. Everything is meaningless. All go to the same place, and all come from dust, and dust all return. Who knows if the human spirit rises upwards, and if the spirit of the animals goes down into earth? So I saw that there is nothing better for a person than to enjoy their work, because that is their lot. For who can bring them to see what will happen after them?
Anybody that's spent any time around a toddler has heard the loud and sour complaint, it's not fair. It's like the song of their people, what they are known for. A 3-year-old doesn't understand labor law, they don't understand treaty rights, but a toddler can't explain where the sun goes when the sun goes down. But a toddler, a 3-year-old, sure thinks they know when something's fair and when it isn't. It reminds me of a psychology study that Daniel introduced me to a few years ago, and he says I've shown this to you once before, but it's so good I want to show it to you again. It's an experiment on capuchin monkeys and their assessment of fairness. So I'll need the sound up on there.
So a final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs, and with birds, and with chimpanzees. But with Sarah Brosnan, we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put 2 capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the 2 monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now, if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, that's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber, and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
So it seems even monkeys know when things are fair and when they are not. Now, I'm sure when I was a kid, I would do my fair bit of complaining, but I do remember as a young adult encountering a different kind of unfairness, like a whole new level of injustice. It was one of my first experiences as an adult of something that was just plain unjust. And it wasn't going to be made right. It was not fair. Now, I won't get into the details. It was a toxic work environment. I was a lifeguard at some apartment buildings managed by Effort Trust in Hamilton. But at one point, I was physically and verbally assaulted in the workplace. Hamilton Regional Police were involved. I went to court. I had a co-worker that was charged. And in other ways and in other matters, I was just not treated fairly in this whole process. And of course, there have been people that have suffered far greater situations than what I was subjected to. But this is the first time I'd ever run into anything quite like this. It was just not fair, and nobody was going to make this right. And I remember I was 22 at the time, and I was furious with how I was being treated and with how I was being dealt with. It wasn't fair. Now, my mom and I are wired, and so we conspired with various different forms of response, which I have learned since have a name. They're called retributive justice. So they are a real thing. We had lots of plans about how we were going to set the score right. We were going to set it even, or at least closer to even. But I remember my dad's response in the whole thing. My dad said, yeah, you're absolutely right. This is not right. It's not fair. And it's not going to be fair. I remember him observing that there were going to be things in life that were like this, that are just not fair. And on some level, you are just going to have to live with that. Now, I don't remember his exact words, but the notion was that there was sometimes that you were just going to take an L. And I, at the time, did not like that, but I have found that to be true. And so what I want to do this morning is a little bit like a sermon discussion class time. I want to take a minute here and just share with the people sitting next to you or the people around you, what are some unfair experiences that you have experienced, big or small? It could be something in the past, it could be something funny, it could be something not funny. What are some unfair experiences that you have experienced or that you are struggling with, and what, if anything, can be done about it? What responses? And so if you are, around a few people that are younger than you, this might be a great opportunity for you to share your first experience of when things were just plain not fair. So I'd invite you to get up. We'll take a few minutes to do this. Find a small group of people and just share a few stories before we'll continue. Did you bring the mic to the back? I did. Okay. There we go. Okay. So we won't take a whole lot of time with this, but are there any, did you learn anything new, or did you hear anything that was a good example of just running into something unfair? Okay, you got it?
Yeah. You?
Okay, so Lawrence will share one.
So Elaine had a really good one about how she tried to have fairness when her kids, she had 3 kids, so she'd sometimes give them potato chips in their lunch. So she had a weigh scale to make sure that everyone. But then she thought, well, the oldest one needs a little more calories, so gave him a few grams more, and this caused civil unrest.
So fairness right to the gram. All right. Yeah, that's about right. Okay, and we've got one more over here, Joe. Yeah, right over there.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, Dwight, stand up. Stand up, Dwight. When me and Dwayne played golf, I had my worst golf game ever. He beat me by 10 strokes.
Okay, that's not fair. Okay, Liam has one.
Liam? Yep, Liam is one.
All right.
Sometimes me and Daniel fight over who gets the last cupcake, but then we fight so hard that we both decide we both don't get it, and it ends up staying there for the next 2 weeks.
Okay, the next time you're fighting over a cupcake, just let me know. I can solve that.
Dad, you're supposed to be on a diet, Dad.
Okay. So, some of the examples that we come up with are in these situations can be funny and lighthearted, but it, of course, wouldn't take a group this size long if we just gave it a few minutes to uncover some really serious examples of injustice that are not funny at all. Grievous things that have been suffered by us or by those that we love. Great injustices that have left us even questioning God or questioning God's own justice. If God is just, then why does God allow unjust things to take place? And as followers of Jesus, what can we do about injustice that we see or injustice that happens to us? This is exactly the question that the teacher addresses indirectly here in what William read for us this morning, this text that closes out chapter 3 of the book of Ecclesiastes. So if you've got a Bible, I'd invite you to turn there as we're going to look at that again. Last week we talked about there's a time for every season, that there's a time to live and a time to die, a time to tear and a time to mend. But in all these things, and some of them are good and some of them are bad, what we do and what we participate in is temporary, but what God accomplishes is forever. The teacher says in verse 14, I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it. Nothing can be taken away from it. God does it so that people will fear him. Whatever is has always been, and whatever will be has been before, and God will call the past to account. We find our temporary place in the world and that God has established, and we use our limited means and we use our limited awareness to make sense of what God has accomplished and what God is still accomplishing. The teacher says God will call the past into account. In other words, God will settle scores that seem out of sync. God will take care of things that we think haven't been taken care of. But then the teacher observes something most uncomfortable. In verse 16, the teacher makes a startling observation. Even though everything that God does endures forever, even though nothing that God has done can be taken away or added to, and assuming that God is going to set all scores straight, when the teacher goes looking, he notices in the place of judgment, where there should be justice, there is wickedness. Where there should be righteousness, wickedness exists. And it's not just that there's wickedness in the dark crevices of the world. What the teacher says is that the wickedness has found its way to the seat of judgment, to a place that's meant to protect the vulnerable, courts and lawmakers, governments and law enforcement. They can all become places where evil can flourish. I remember one year while we were out camping at Manitou, we had received some rain overnight, and we were dealing with that struggle that you have when camping of keeping dry things dry and cold things cold. And I woke up in the morning to find slugs on the counter of our kitchen. And I thought, oh, that's gross. And I was cleaning that up, and I took a look at our cooler. When I opened it up, I realized our cooler, where the cool stuff was being stored, also had slugs in it. The cooler had a drain plug that had been left open, and so slugs had found their way through the drain hole, and now slugs are working their way through our lettuce and through our vegetables and through our cheese. Now, in the same way, the teacher says anyone can see injustice and wickedness where justice should be. And while it's true that God is sovereign over everything that God has created, some things in the world are broken, and they are not going to get fixed anytime soon, at least not fast enough. And so the question is, what do we do with that? The teacher doesn't shy away from sober reality like this. He wonders, are we ultimately better than any animals? We seem to end up in the same place as animals, whether we are just or unjust. Are we, in fact, any better than just a bunch of monkeys squawking over cucumbers and grapes? In the end, in verse 22, the teacher returns to his more positive, or at the very least, more practical sense. In verse 22, he says, "So I saw that there is nothing better for a person to do than to enjoy their work, because that's their lot. For who can bring them to see what will happen after them?" The teacher here is repeating a piece of advice that he's given before. And in fact, if you look at the rest of the book of Ecclesiastes, he's going to return to this point 4 more times. It's a gift from God, the satisfaction of a job well done. And it should be received as a gift and appreciated and enjoyed as such. Now, on the other hand, wealth and fame and all the other things that we think come from work, they don't last. And the teacher told us last week, work hard, enjoy the satisfaction of a job well done, but know that life isn't fair. And sometimes you're just going to have to take an L. But at the very end, the teacher points to something interesting, outside the frame, so to speak. Who can bring them to see what will come after them? What does he mean by that? It's hard for us to actually know what's fair, because we don't see everything. We don't know all the things that have taken place. Something that might look unfair might actually end up as deserved. Maybe Russ should get a few more chips than everybody else in the house. Does God settle scores after we die? Is that what happens? Is the teacher suggesting that God then takes all the people who have been extra fortunate in life, all the people that have been disproportionately rewarded through their life here on earth, and takes them down a notch in the age to come? So therefore, if we've had a fortunate life, if we have eaten well, if we have families that haven't died of preventable diseases, do we have a reckoning that we need to worry about in the life to come? I don't think that would be a good thing for anybody in this room. As bad as we might think we have it, if all the problems that have ever been suffered, if all the injustices that have ever been endured were somehow put into a bowl, and you could reach in and take one of those and trade it for what you're dealing with right now, would you make that trade? Not a chance. No way. That's not the way, though, that God works. It's not the way that God's described in the Bible. God does not trade in karma. God does not settle scores the way humans do. What the teacher is saying this morning is that, yes, wickedness does exist in places where justice should be. But we don't see the whole picture. Who can bring them to see what will happen after them? In other words, the teacher is saying there's more to see than just what we have experienced and what we've observed. There are things that are outside the frame of the picture that we are looking at. For the teacher, Jesus, stands outside the frame. The teacher never knew Jesus or the sacrifice that Jesus made on the cross. Now, it doesn't mean that God turns a blind eye to justice. The problem is we just can't see everything that God is doing working towards God's ultimate restoration. Now, I know it's a poor metaphor, but have you ever lived in a house while it is being renovated? Almost 20 years ago, we had our kitchen torn up and rebuilt. And so we set up a temporary kitchen in the dining room and had to bring in pans of water to wash dishes. We had to work out of the laundry room sink for most of those 2 months. Things were not right. And for a few weeks, it certainly seemed like it was getting worse every day, more broken and more disrupted. Only Julie and I could even just barely imagine the thing that we were working towards. And I don't know what the kids thought we were doing, just purposely tearing the house apart, I guess. But Julie and I could see that the destruction and the dysfunction was happening in the place where the greatest change was going to take place. The new kitchen that we could imagine was going to be there one day would fill the space where the sawdust and where the broken drywall was. We knew that we just had to trust the process. In ways that we can barely understand, God is working just outside the frame of our world. And God responds to injustice by taking it upon himself. Jesus didn't just take your sin and nail it to the cross. Jesus took your shame as well. Jesus died the most shameful death so that you would not have to suffer shame because of your sin. We realize our shame and we release it to the saving work of Jesus Christ. But the death of Jesus does still more than that. Jesus takes our sin and shame. But Jesus also took the blame for every unjust act, the guilt of every other person. When we see injustice, we see, in part, someone else's guilt. When we see injustice, we see someone else's sin, perhaps perpetrated against us, or perhaps perpetrated against someone else. We're looking at someone else's guilt, someone else's shame. And when we suffer because of someone else's sin, if we're not careful, we forget ourselves. We see injustice and we want revenge, forgetting our own sin has been forgiven. When God forgives our sin, God forgives other people's sin too. When Jesus nails our sin to the cross, taking it away as far as the east is from the west, Jesus is also working in the lives of the other people, some of whom have wounded us. Jesus is taking the wickedness that looks like it's standing in the place of justice, and he nails that to the cross too. It is getting dealt with. It's getting dealt with by the blood of Jesus. Jesus is taking our enemy's sin away too. And we grieve that in a way. If we're honest, we struggle with letting other people off the hook, so to speak. I know it's one of the selfish sins that I am guilty of. I want grace for me, but I want justice for everybody else. I want forgiveness, and I want the right to live in freedom from my sin and my shame, but when somebody wrongs me, the question is, can I release their sin to Jesus too? Now, there's a whole sermon on this. We could drill down on this. We just don't have time for it this morning. Sin is forgiven, but it also has earthly consequences, of course. Now, we can forgive someone who has sinned against us, but that doesn't mean that you invite them back into your life or that they take that same place that they always have had. There is such a thing as healthy boundaries and responding to the reality of sinful structures in our lives. It means that someone that's wounded you, you don't necessarily invite them back into your life in the way that they used to be. Sin does have earthly consequences that we have to recognize. But we live with grace, and we also, at the same time, live with wisdom. So what can we do? Well, we can protest and we can plead in prayer, the way the psalmist does. One of the things that Scripture does is it shows us the right kind of lament and the right kind of grieving, the way to talk to God about the sin and the injustice that we experience. And so I recommend you go look at Psalm 10 or go look at Psalm 94. Our prayers at times can be bland and wishy-washy. But when they're compared to the words of Psalm 10 or Psalm 94, rise up, O God, and lift your hand. Don't forget the helpless. Make things right. Psalm 10, verse 12. God has thick skin. God can hear us complain about what we think is unjust and respond accordingly. On the night of January 22nd, 1999, Graham Staines and his two sons, Philip, who was 10, and Timothy, who was 6, were sleeping in their station wagon after attending a Christian camp in Odisha in India. Out of nowhere, unknown to them, a violent mob was protesting nearby and surrounded the vehicle, setting it on fire and preventing them from escape. And all three of them died. The attack shocked the world, and Graham's only crime had been that he had spent decades as a missionary working with people who suffered from leprosy, people who were otherwise neglected by society. Graham's wife Gladys was back home in India and suddenly found out that she was a widow. She was a mother grieving the loss of her husband and her two sons, all because of an act of hatred. Now, many expected her to respond with anger or issue calls for revenge, described as justice. But instead, Gladys publicly forgave her killers. And it shocked people. She later explained that she could forgive them because Christ had first forgiven her. She believed that Jesus had already carried both her sins and the sins of those who murdered her family to the cross. She continued to serve as a missionary in India for years afterwards, rather than returning home in anger. Now, of course, Jesus was not responsible for this crime. Rather, Christians believe that on the cross, Jesus bears guilt and punishment for sin. Isaiah 53 talks about how the wounds of Jesus, the suffering servant, provide healing for us. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, God made him who knew no sin to become sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God. And 1 Peter 2:24 reads, he himself bore our sins on his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. Gladys understood that justice ultimately comes from God. And because of that faith, she didn't have to carry the burden of vengeance. She was set free from it. And that, too, came from the blood of Jesus. Now, it's important to observe that forgiveness did not ease her grief, of course. She still mourned deeply. She'd suffered great loss. But in the years that followed, she often spoke about how forgiveness freed her from being imprisoned by her own bitterness, rather than allowing it and allowing the perpetrators to continue to control her life through anger. She chose to remain faithful to Christ's calling. Now, forgiveness is not pretending that evil didn't happen. Forgiveness is releasing our right for personal vengeance because we trust that Jesus has dealt with sin and that God alone is the perfect judge. We trust God with justice and with fairness, even when we can't see how it's working. The grace of God working just outside the frame is powerful enough to prevent evil from claiming one more victim, you and your sometimes wicked heart.